The letter was tucked under my windshield wiper on a Tuesday morning in February, and for a second I thought it was a parking ticket. It wasn't. It was from my landlord's management company, a formal notice of lease termination, printed on pale yellow paper that had gone slightly damp from the overnight frost. I stood there in the parking lot of my apartment building in Guelph, Ontario, still in my jacket from the night shift, and I read it 3 times because I kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less permanent. They didn't. 14 days. That was all I had left before I was expected to vacate the unit I had lived in for 2.5 years. My name is Brett Harmon, and up until about 4 months before that morning, I had been doing okay. Not great. Nobody doing shift work at a mid-sized logistics warehouse in the industrial end of Guelph is doing great, but okay. I paid my bills on time. I put a little aside each month. I drove a 7-year-old Civic that needed new winter tires but still started every morning, which in a southern Ontario February feels like a minor miracle. I had a routine, and routines have a way of making life feel more solid than it actually is. Then the warehouse restructured. That's what the email said. Operational restructuring, which turned out to mean that the entire overnight inventory team, 12 of us, was being replaced by an automated system the company had apparently been piloting for months without telling anyone. We were walked out by HR on a Thursday afternoon with 2 weeks of severance and a laminated sheet about employment insurance and benefits. I remember standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box of my personal items, a phone charger, a water bottle, a photo of my dog from before she passed, and thinking that the world had just quietly swallowed me whole without even making a sound. The EI came through, which helped but not enough. Not in Guelph, where rents had climbed steadily for years, and a 1-bedroom in a decent building ran close to $1,400 a month. I applied for everything I could find. I sent out resumes the way you throw change into a fountain, without much faith but unable to stop yourself. Retail positions, delivery routes, a job posting for a night security guard at a storage facility that I would have taken without hesitation, but never heard back about. The weeks stretched out, and the money I had saved began to disappear faster than I had ever thought possible when I was earning it. If this story has ever felt familiar to you, if you've ever stood in a parking lot holding a letter you didn't want to read, I want you to take a moment before we go further. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that things can change. Subscribe to Honor Stories, because every week we share real accounts of people who found their way through the hardest chapters of their lives. And I promise this story is worth staying for. By the time the notice arrived on my windshield, I had already missed 2 rent payments. The first one I caught up on, the second one I didn't. The property management company, a faceless corporate office somewhere in Mississauga, had processed the termination notice the moment I hit the legal threshold. There was no phone call, no knock on the door, just pale yellow paper and 14 days. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed without taking my jacket off. The apartment was cold because I had started keeping the heat lower to save on hydro. Outside, the street was gray and still, the kind of February quiet that feels less peaceful and more like the world has simply given up making noise. I did the math on my phone. Even if I found a job that week, a first and last month's deposit somewhere new was money I didn't have. My credit was bruised. My savings were gone. I had maybe 3 weeks of food in the cupboards and $400 left in my account. I didn't tell anyone for the first few days. That's the part that nobody talks about when they describe financial hardship from the outside. It's not just the money, it's the silence you build around yourself to keep the shame from getting out. I didn't call my parents because they were retired and had their own fixed income to manage, and I couldn't bear to become a problem for them. I didn't tell my friends because I didn't know how to say it without it, sounding like I had failed at something basic, at something everyone else around me seemed to manage without much trouble. On day 6, I started looking at what I could sell. A spare monitor. Some tools I had accumulated over the years that were sitting in a plastic bin in my closet. A camping tent I had used maybe twice. I posted everything on Facebook Marketplace and made about $240 over 3 days, which felt like both a lot and nothing at all. On day 9, I started packing. I didn't have a plan for where I was going. My car was big enough for sleeping in a pinch, and I had done it once before during a camping trip, though that was a different kind of not having a roof. I pulled a duffel bag from under the bed and started folding things slowly, the way you do when the act of packing is itself a kind of admission. That was when someone knocked on my door. I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was the building superintendent coming to check on things, to make sure I was actually leaving. But when I opened the door, it wasn't him. It was a woman I had seen maybe 4 or 5 times since I moved in, always in the stairwell or the parking lot, always carrying something, always moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had a great many things to manage and very little patience for wasted time. Her name was Sandra Kowalczyk. She owned the building. I had not known that until that moment. I had always assumed she was another tenant. She dressed simply, drove a modest car, and there was nothing about her that announced ownership of anything. She was maybe 60, with the kind of face that didn't give much away, but somehow still made you feel like she was paying close attention. She told me she had just gotten back from spending the winter with her daughter in Victoria, and had gone through the building's files that morning when she returned. She asked if she could come in. I looked around at the half-packed room, the open duffel bag, the boxes, the bare shelf above the couch where I used to keep things that made the place feel like mine, and I felt a particular kind of embarrassment that has no clean name. But I stepped back and let her in. She didn't pretend not to see what she was seeing. She looked at the boxes, at the bags, at the stripped-down quality of the apartment, and then she looked at me with an expression that wasn't pity, but was something close to recognition, like she had seen this particular version of a moment before. She said she hadn't authorized the termination notice personally. The management company handled day-to-day decisions on her behalf while she was away, and they had followed the legal process correctly, so there was nothing technically wrong with what they had done. But she said that finding out after the fact that a tenant who had lived here for 2.5 years and had never once caused a problem was 14 days away from losing his home didn't sit right with her. Then she asked me what happened. I'm not someone who talks easily about things that embarrass me. I learned early that the safest thing is usually to keep your situation to yourself until you've already solved it, because people's opinions of you can change faster than your circumstances can. But there was something about the way Sandra Kowalczyk stood in my apartment, unhurried, not filling the silence with reassurances, just waiting, that made the whole story come out before I had decided to tell it. I told her about the warehouse, about the restructuring email, about the weeks of applications that went nowhere, about the math that simply didn't work no matter how many times I recalculated it, about the 2 missed rent payments, and the way shame had convinced me that silence was better than asking for help. When I stopped talking, the room was quiet for a long moment. She nodded slowly, as if she had been mentally sorting everything I said into a shape that made sense to her. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. Before she had bought this building, and 4 others around Guelph and Cambridge, Sandra had spent nearly 20 years working in workforce development. She had run programs through the local labor market partnership that helped workers displaced by automation and industry shifts find footing again. It was work she had loved, and eventually stepped back from when her husband got sick, but she had never fully stopped thinking about it. In fact, she had been talking to some former colleagues recently about whether there was still a need for something smaller and more local, something that didn't require people to navigate a bureaucracy to get help finding their next step. She had the idea. She had the connections. What she didn't have was someone who understood the situation from the inside. She looked at me and made an offer. She would cancel the termination notice and hold the rent for 3 months, interest-free, to be repaid whenever I was working again. In exchange, she wanted me to help her build something, a small community employment resource, operating out of a vacant commercial unit she owned on Wyndham Street, designed specifically for workers in the skilled trades and logistics sector who had been displaced by automation. Not a charity, she said. A bridge. I remember almost laughing, though nothing was funny. Me? Help build a program? I was the one who needed the program, I told her that. I said it exactly like that, and she didn't flinch. She said she had found, over 20 years of this work, that the people who had lived through displacement were the only ones who truly understood what it felt like to sit across a table from someone who needed more than a job board. They understood the silence, the shame, the way the system assumes you know how to navigate it when nobody ever taught you. Then she told me to think about it and let her know by the weekend. I didn't need until the weekend. The next Monday, we were standing in a narrow storefront on Wyndham Street with a set of keys Sandra had dug out of a filing cabinet and a lot of cold air coming through the windows. The space had been empty for about 8 months, A former insurance office, still with its low-drop ceiling and a faint smell of old carpet and photocopier ink. We walked the floor together and Sandra started talking about what it could be, and something about the way she described it made it feel less like an idea and more like something that already existed and was just waiting to be uncovered. We spent the first 2 weeks cleaning. I mean that literally, scrubbing floors, hauling out outdated furniture, painting over scuffed beige walls with a warm gray that Sandra had picked up from a discount bin at a home hardware in Cambridge. She paid for the supplies. I provided the labor. It felt fair in a way I hadn't expected, because it was the first time in months I had gone to bed physically tired instead of just emotionally hollow. Sandra started making calls. She had kept her network from her workforce development years. Training coordinators, HR contacts at regional employers, a woman named Beverly, who ran the trades apprenticeship liaison office at Conestoga College, and who showed up on a Wednesday afternoon with a box of resource guides and more energy than both of us combined. I started reaching out to workers I knew from the warehouse, guys who had been in the same boat I had been in, who were still adrift 4 months after the restructuring. 2 of them came by on a Saturday morning and helped us put together a set of used desks Sandra had bought off Kijiji. We called it the Kowalczyk Bridge Center. Sandra had initially resisted putting her name on it, but I told her that a name matters. It signals to people that there is a real human being accountable for what happens inside these walls, and not just a logo or a committee. She eventually agreed, though she made me promise we'd change it if she ever started to embarrass herself. We opened on a Thursday in March, quietly, with no ribbon cutting and no press release. Just a sign in the window and a post on the neighborhood Facebook group. By the end of that first week, 9 people had walked through the door. I remember the third one especially. His name was Curtis Beaumont, 47 years old, formerly a line supervisor at a food processing plant in Fergus that had automated its entire packaging operation over the course of 6 months. He had been looking for work for nearly a year. He sat down across from me at one of the Kijiji desks, and the look on his face was one I recognized immediately. The careful way he held himself, the controlled flatness of his voice, the way he looked just slightly to the left of my face rather than directly at me. That's what extended job searching does to you. It teaches you to keep your needs small and contained so it doesn't make other people uncomfortable. I told him what had happened to me. I didn't dress it up. I told him about the termination notice and the duffel bag and the $400. His expression shifted. Not to pity, but to something more like relief, the way a room feels when someone finally opens a window. We spent 2 hours together that afternoon going through his transferable skills and identifying 3 industries within 45 minutes of Fergus that had active apprenticeship and entry pathways for supervisory experience. He walked out with a list of specific contacts and a follow-up appointment for the following week. 6 weeks later, he sent me a text to say he had accepted a position as a production coordinator at a regional food distribution company in Elora. I read it sitting at my desk and had to take a minute before I could respond. It's hard to explain what that felt like, except to say that it was the first time in a very long time that something I had done had made a measurable difference to another person's life. And that turned out to be a feeling I hadn't known I was starving for. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. If you've made it this far in the story, chances are some part of it has landed somewhere real for you. I'd love for you to comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and share one act of genuine kindness you've either witnessed or received. It doesn't have to be dramatic. The smallest things have a way of mattering the most. About 2 months after we opened, Sandra brought in a contact she had known for years, a woman named Patricia who ran a regional employment and skills consultancy out of Kitchener and who had partnered with Sandra on programs back in the 90s. Patricia came in for what was supposed to be a 40-minute meeting and stayed for most of the afternoon. She walked the space, talked to 3 clients who happened to be there, and then sat down with Sandra and said she wanted to bring her consultancy into a formal partnership with the center, offering subsidized skills assessments and resume coaching on a weekly basis. That partnership changed everything about what we could offer. Within 3 months of it being in place, the center was seeing between 15 and 20 clients a week. Sandra hired a part-time coordinator, a recent social work graduate from the University of Guelph named Isabel, who had the rare ability to be warm and efficient at the same time. Meanwhile, I had kept applying for work. Sandra had never suggested I shouldn't, The arrangement had always been temporary in terms of my unpaid role, and we both understood that. I had actually started to feel ready again in a way I hadn't for most of the previous 6 months. The daily work of the center had rebuilt something in me that the job loss had quietly dismantled. A sense that I was capable of things, that my experience had value, that I wasn't simply a resume that kept getting passed over. One afternoon in late April, a man came in who wasn't there for himself. He introduced himself as George Tanner, and he'd heard about the center from Curtis, the former line supervisor from Fergus. George ran a regional logistics and warehousing operation out of a facility near the 401 in Cambridge, and he had recently expanded his business to include a new contract with a national grocery distribution chain. He needed experienced warehouse staff, and he specifically needed someone who understood inventory systems and overnight shift management. He looked at me when he said that last part. I almost missed it. I was standing by the coffee station pretending to organize something, and Sandra was the one who said quietly, "Brett, come and sit down." The conversation with George Tanner lasted maybe 20 minutes. He asked about my experience, I told him. He asked what I knew about the specific inventory management system his operation used. I had worked with the same software for 3 years at the warehouse in the Squelch. He nodded. He said he liked to meet people in person before he passed them to HR, and that if I wanted to come in for a formal interview, he could set one up for later that week. I drove home afterward and sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time, not because I was upset. I just needed a moment to feel the full weight of what had just happened, without immediately having to do something about it. 4 months earlier, I had been packing a duffel bag with nowhere to go. Now I was sitting in my car in the February cold, though it was April now and the snow had finally retreated, holding a business card from a man who wanted to interview me for a real job. Not a placeholder, not a bridge, a career. The interview was on a Thursday. I drove to Cambridge with enough time to sit in the parking lot for 15 minutes and remind myself that I had done harder things than this recently, which turned out to be true and also useful. George Tanner's HR manager met me at reception, took me through 2 rounds of questions, and introduced me to the operations manager, a quiet and very competent woman named Rachel who asked 3 very specific questions about inventory reconciliation and seemed satisfied with my answers. 2 days later, George Tanner called me himself. He offered me the position of overnight operations supervisor. Full-time, benefits starting after 3 months. A salary that was meaningfully higher than what I had been making at the old warehouse. I said yes before he had finished the sentence. I told Sandra the same evening. She was locking up the center when I arrived, and I stood on the sidewalk on Wyndham Street and told her what had happened. She smiled in the particular way she had that was warm without being theatrical, and she said she wasn't surprised. Not because she had arranged it, which she hadn't, but because she had seen enough of these moments over the years to know that when a person stops asking the world to recognize their value and starts demonstrating it through action, things tend to fall into place. I'm not sure I fully believe in that as a universal law. Life is complicated, and luck is unevenly distributed, and plenty of people do everything right and still don't get a George Tanner walking through a door. But I do believe that what Sandra did for me, the 3 months, the bridge, created the conditions for something to happen that could not have happened while I was sitting alone in a cold apartment, shrinking myself to fit the size of my fear. I started the job at the Cambridge facility in May. I kept volunteering at the Kowalczyk Bridge Center on Saturday mornings, partly because I felt I owed something to the continuity of the place, and partly because I had learned, in the months since Curtis Beaumont's text message, that the work genuinely mattered to me in a way I hadn't predicted. Sandra eventually formalized the center as a registered nonprofit, which opened up access to funding through the Ontario Trillium Foundation and a handful of regional community grants. Patricia's consultancy deepened their partnership. Conestoga College came on as an official educational partner. Isabel went from part-time coordinator to full-time program manager. As of last winter, the Kowalczyk Bridge Center has helped more than 400 workers in the Guelph-Cambridge corridor find employment, training programs, or viable next steps after job displacement. 400 people, most of them because a woman who had been wintering in Victoria came home to check her files and decided that a piece of paper tipped under a windshield wiper wasn't the whole story. People ask me sometimes if I ever found out why Sandra came to my door personally, why she didn't just have the management company handle it, or leave it to the legal process that was already underway. I asked her once, directly, during a slow Tuesday at the center, when we were both waiting for the afternoon clients to arrive. She thought about it for a moment and then said she had come back from her daughter's place in Victoria feeling slightly unmoored, the way she sometimes did after long trips, when the ordinary life she had built for herself looked briefly unfamiliar. She had sat down with the building files partly out of duty and partly as a way of re-anchoring herself in the concrete and manageable. And when she saw my file, 2.5 years, no complaints, 1 documented job loss and 2 missed payments, she said something just didn't add up. People who pay on time for 2.5 years don't suddenly stop because they've decided rent isn't worth it. They stop because something happened to them. And she thought that if she was the kind of person who spent 20 years helping people, when something happened to them, she probably shouldn't stop just because she had bought a few buildings. I have thought about that answer a lot since she gave it. I think about it when I'm doing the overnight shift in Cambridge and the warehouse is quiet, and I can hear the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of the 401. I think about it on Saturday mornings when I'm sitting across from someone at the center who has the same careful stillness. Curtis had the first time he sat down, and I know what's underneath it, and I know that what they need more than anything is to feel like the next part of their story is still worth telling. That's what Sandra gave me. Not money, not a free apartment, not a job. She gave me the next part of the story, and I have been trying in whatever ways I can to pass that on. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who might be in the middle of a hard chapter right now. Subscribe to Honor Stories. We share accounts like this one every week. Stories about ordinary people navigating extraordinary moments with grace and grit. And leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about one person who showed up for you when it mattered. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Because the truth is, the moment that feels most like an ending, the pale yellow letter, the half-packed bag, the cold apartment, that moment is almost never actually the end.